The British Museum has boxes of tablets.
In a museum drawer, a fragment of the world's oldest story sat unread for over 100 years, not because it was lost, but because nobody knew it belonged to anything. Multiply that by 500,000 tablets, and you get the actual scale of the problem. Humanity wrote down the first chapter of its own history, then buried it under its own backlog. Scientists used AI to translate ancient Sumerian tablets, and what changed wasn't one dramatic discovery. It was finally being able to read what had been sitting there the whole time. That shift didn't happen all at once. It started in 2023, when a team first got a machine to translate the language itself, not because it learned to think like an ancient scribe, but because it learned to read faster than one ever could. What cuneiform actually is. Before any of this AI work makes sense, the writing system itself needs to be understood, because most people picture something closer to hieroglyphics, the picture-based writing carved into Egyptian temple walls, than what actually survives here. Cuneiform is not a language. It is a writing system, pressed rather than drawn, made by pushing the cut end of a reed stylus, a pen-like tool shaped from a hollow plant stem, into wet clay to leave a wedge-shaped mark.
Script. Mesopotamian cultures used it. It was invented by the Sumerians.
Sumerian scribes, the trained record keepers of ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq, developed it roughly 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. In doing so, they created something rarer than the script itself suggests, because almost every writing system in history was built by borrowing from one that came before it. Cuneiform is one of only 4 writing systems in the entire archaeological record, with no known influence from any earlier system. It was not adapted from something older. It was invented from nothing, which means the people who created it had no model to copy and no earlier mistakes to learn from. That invention did not stay simple for long. The system eventually grew to include more than 1,000 distinct characters, and no two scribes rendered them quite the same way. The same problem handwriting has always caused, just spread across 3,000 years of writers instead of one classroom. A single character's shape could shift depending on the era it was written in, the region it came from, and the individual hand pressing the stylus into the clay, hand meaning the actual scribe doing the writing. The same way your own handwriting looks different from anyone else's. That variability is part of what has made cuneiform so difficult to work with ever since, and it is the exact problem modern researchers are still fighting today. What scribes actually recorded with all those wedge-shaped marks ran the full range of a functioning civilization. Some tablets are as mundane as a grain shipment, a written record of wheat or barley being moved from a farm to a city storehouse, or a livestock receipt for animals bought and sold. Others are school exercises, the handwriting drills of children learning to write thousands of years ago. And some are among the most significant texts in human history, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, widely considered the oldest known work of literature on Earth. None of it should have survived this long, and the reason it did comes down to the material itself. Clay tablets do not burn the way papyrus, an early paper made from a reed plant, does. If anything, fire made the clay stronger. Baked hard by the same flames that destroyed entire libraries of papyrus elsewhere in the ancient world, clay tablets simply hardened instead of disappearing. So the fires that erased so much of the ancient world actually preserved Mesopotamia's record by accident. That survival is what set up the problem this story is really about. Hundreds of thousands of these tablets exist today, sitting in museum drawers and archive shelves around the world. The writing on them has been readable, in principle, for over 1.5 centuries. Almost none of it has actually been read. And that gap between what could be read and what has been read is exactly where this story picks up. The bottleneck. That gap did not appear because nobody could crack the code. It appeared because cracking the code turned out to be only half the problem. and for 150 years, almost no one noticed. The other half was still unsolved. Cuneiform was first cracked roughly 165 years ago, meaning scholars figured out how the wedge-shaped marks corresponded to sounds and words. The breakthrough came from something called the Behistun inscription, a massive carving on a cliff face in what is now Iran, written in 3 different ancient languages side by side, describing the same royal victory. Because researchers could already read one of those 3 languages, they could use it to work out the other 2. The same way, a much more famous stone slab, the Rosetta Stone, lets scholars crack Egyptian hieroglyphics using a parallel Greek translation carved into the same block. Once cuneiform gave up its secrets that way, the script stopped being a mystery in theory. But knowing how to read something and actually reading all of it turned out to be 2 very different jobs. In practice, almost nothing changed for most of the tablets still sitting in the ground and in museum storage. Being readable and being translated are 2 different things, and the distance between them turned out to be enormous. By recent estimates, roughly 90% of known cuneiform texts have still never been translated into any modern language, despite the code having been broken for a century and a half. The reason comes down to simple math. Museums and universities around the world hold more than 500,000 cuneiform tablets, and only a small number of people alive today, estimates run from around 75 to a few hundred, can read the script fluently enough to translate it. In other words, a tiny handful of human experts are the only bridge between 500,000 ancient documents and anyone who wants to know what they say. But the tablets themselves make the job harder still. Most of what survives is not in pristine condition. They arrive broken, edges crumbled away, whole sections of text simply gone, so a scholar is often reading a story with no clear beginning or end. And decades of excavation and museum collecting have scattered pieces of the exact same original tablet across entirely different countries. So a fragment sitting in one city's archive might be the missing half of a fragment sitting in another city's archive, with nothing on record to connect the 2. The cost of that scattering is not abstract. It took scholars more than 100 years to identify the fragment containing the opening lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, sitting the entire time in a museum drawer, unrecognized simply because nobody had reason to connect it to the rest of the story. If the most famous work of ancient literature in the world could stay unrecognized for a full century, it says everything about how much everyday material, ordinary shipping records, school exercises, ordinary lives, has simply never been looked at closely enough to matter. That is the exact bottleneck artificial intelligence was brought in to break. First AI breakthrough, translating the language itself. Breaking that bottleneck meant starting with the most basic question of all. Could a machine actually translate the language itself, the same way apps translate French or Spanish today? If a computer could do that, then 90% of untranslated tablets stopped being a 100-year problem and became a software problem instead. In 2023, a team at Tel Aviv University, led by researcher Guy Guthhertz, built a system to test exactly that. Their target was Akkadian, the ancient language that used cuneiform script for roughly 3,000 years, spoken across Mesopotamia long after the Sumerians who invented the writing system had disappeared. The tool they built used neural machine translation, the same underlying technology that powers Google Translate, and they trained it on a large digital library of existing cuneiform texts called the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus, a database built up over years by scholars who had already translated a portion of these tablets by hand. The system could translate 2 different ways. It could take a transliteration, meaning cuneiform already converted into our own alphabet by a human scholar, and turn that into English. Or, more ambitiously, It could look at the raw, wedge-shaped symbols themselves and translate straight from Cuneiform to English, skipping the human transliteration step entirely. To measure how good the results actually were, the researchers used a standard scoring system called Blue 4, the same metric used to grade any machine translation. Their model scored in the mid-30s. For comparison, Google Translate scores around 60 translating. Between Spanish and English, a language pair with decades of data and living speakers to draw from. So this was a real result, not a perfect one, and the researchers said so themselves. That honesty matters because the system's accuracy was not even. It performed best on formulaic writing, the rigid repetitive language found in royal decrees or administrative records, but it struggled more with literary and poetic texts, the letters, hymns and prayers, where meaning depends on nuance rather than pattern. And in those harder cases, the AI sometimes produced what researchers call hallucinations, sentences with no real connection to what the original tablet actually said. Something unexpected showed up in the results, though. Something the researchers had not even been trying to build. Even when a translation came out wrong, the system could almost always identify what kind of text it was looking at, whether a legal document, a royal inscription, just from the style and rhythm of the language. Nobody had trained it to do that specifically. It had picked up the shape of an ancient bureaucracy's writing on its own. Translating the words was one problem solved. But before any of this could even begin, someone first had to teach a computer to see the individual wedge-shaped characters clearly enough to read in the first place, and that turned out to be its own separate fight. Reading the characters. Translating a transliteration into English is one kind of problem. Turning a photograph of a genuinely worn, 5,000-year-old clay tablet into a transliteration in the first place is a completely different one, and it sits a full step earlier in the process. This is the problem a team from Cornell and Tel Aviv University set out to solve, led by Cornell computer scientist Hadar Averbach-Aylor, in research presented in 2025. Their target wasn't meaning, it was in shape. A single cuneiform character does not look identical from one tablet to the next, since its exact form shifts depending on who carved it and when. A human expert can usually recognize the same character despite that drift. A computer, working only from raw pixels in a photograph, has a much harder time telling a genuine variation from a completely different sign. So the team built something that works almost like tracing paper laid over a scan. It starts with a clean, idealized version of a character that you'd find in a reference textbook, then mathematically stretches and reshapes that clean version until it lines up with the actual worn strokes pressed into a real tablet. Because the clean version snaps into place over the real one, the researchers named the tool ProtoSnap. Once a character has been snapped into alignment this way, the system can use it as a labeled example, teaching the next stage of the AI what that character looks like in the real world, not just the textbook. Do that across enough tablets, and the AI gets noticeably better at recognizing characters it has never seen before, including rare ones and ones that vary the most from tablet to tablet. Why that matters beyond the lab comes down to scale. Co-author Yoram Cohen, an archaeology professor at Tel Aviv University, put the actual goal plainly. The aim is to increase the number of ancient sources scholars can work with by a factor of 10, not simply having more tablets to read one at a time, but being able to study thousands of them together at once, the way a single human expert never could in a career, and pull out new, measurable patterns in the religion and legal life of a civilization 5,000 years gone, putting broken tablets back together. Most cuneiform tablets don't survive whole. They survive as fragments, and fragments from the same original tablet often end up scattered across museums in entirely different countries, with nothing on record connecting them. Piecing them back together has always depended on a scholar happening to remember one fragment while looking at another, which is closer to luck than method. Enrique Jimenez, a researcher at LMU Munich, built a system called Fragmentarium to turn that luck into something systematic, using algorithms originally designed to compare gene sequences. The logic transfers surprisingly well. Just as genetics researchers look for overlapping patterns between different copies of DNA, this system looks for overlapping patterns between different tablet fragments, working from transliterations rather than raw images. In 2019, that approach helped identify missing pieces of the Epic of Gilgamesh, matches researchers described as ones that had escaped the attention of humans entirely. Not because no one had looked, because no one had ever had a way to compare thousands of scattered fragments against each other at once. Matching broken pieces back together is one kind of recovery, but some of the richest material in the entire cuneiform record was never broken or lost in the first place. It was simply too ordinary for anyone to bother translating, and that's where the AI went next. The administrative archives. Not every tablet needed rescuing from fire or scattering. Some just needed someone to finally sit down and read them, because nobody considered a grain receipt worth a scholar's career. For a century and a half, that meant thousands of ordinary records simply sat untouched, while experts focused their limited time on literature and royal history instead. Émilie Paget-Perron at the University of Toronto led a project to translate exactly this overlooked material, training an algorithm on 45,500 transliterated Sumerian phrases pulled from administrative records. One version of that algorithm reached 95% translation accuracy, a striking number precisely because this genre is so repetitive and formulaic, which is exactly what makes it easy for a machine to learn. What scholars had dismissed as too boring to prioritize turned out to be the easiest material of all to hand to a computer. The payoff isn't the receipts themselves, it's what's buried inside them. These records carry real names tied to real dates and real job titles, which lets historians trace actual individuals through the ancient bureaucracy that recorded them, including women's documented roles in that economy. Work that simply never survived in any other ancient source. Reading the ordinary record at scale is one discovery. But not everything AI has helped recover was hiding in plain sight. Some of it was hiding in damage itself, in the exact gaps where a tablet had crumbled away entirely. Reading damage and filling gaps. A tablet missing its ending isn't the same problem as a tablet no one has read yet. Here the words exist, they're just gone, and no amount of expertise can read clay that no longer exists. A team at Hebrew University, led by Gabriel Stanovsky, built an AI to predict what belongs in those gaps, training it on transliterations from 10,000 Akkadian tablets. The approach works the same way a phone finishes a text message before you type the last word, except trained on 3,000 years of Akkadian instead of casual texting. Tested against sections scholars had already filled in by hand, the system predicted the missing words with 89% accuracy. That's not the AI reading better than a human expert. It's the AI guessing better than a blank space, and for a text that would otherwise just end mid-sentence, a strong guess is worth having. Every one of these tools solves a different piece of the same problem: reading characters, translating language, matching fragments, filling gaps. But none of it means much without an example of what it actually unlocked. And one recent case shows exactly what reading something for the first time really looks like. The Omen tablets. Every tool so far has been about the process of translation. This one is about what waited on the other side of it, and it's worth pausing on before moving further, because it shows exactly what all this effort is actually for. In 2026, researchers Andrew George and Junko Taniguchi published full translations of 73 Babylonian omens tied to lunar eclipses, tablets the British Museum had physically owned since the 1890s. Worth being clear here, this particular breakthrough came from old-fashioned scholarship, not a computer. Human researchers reading closely, drawing out worn characters by hand, applying decades of training. No AI touched it, but that's exactly why it matters for this story. It shows what finally translated actually delivers, no matter which method gets a tablet there. What the tablet said was blunt. Plague showed, up as a warning. So did the drought. And one omen said nothing more than 4 words: a king will die. Mesopotamian officials didn't just record a warning like that and move on. They acted on it, cutting open a sacrificed animal to examine its organs for signs the threat was real, then carrying out protective rituals if the sign said it was. Behind that single grim line sat an entire government machinery built to react to it. Priests, rituals, and decisions made at the highest level, all triggered by 4 words on a piece of clay. That's what full translation actually recovers. If a fully human translation can still surface something this significant in 2026, the real question is what happens once AI is doing this same work at a scale no group of scholars ever could: the skeptics. Not everyone working in this field is convinced AI is the breakthrough it's made out to be, and the strongest pushback comes from someone with as much authority on cuneiform as anyone alive. Nathan Wasserman, a professor of Assyriology at Hebrew University, spends his career on the hardest material in the entire field: literary and poetic Akkadian, the hymns and prayers where meaning depends on nuance rather than pattern. His view is blunt. He compares handing one of these texts to an AI translator to running Shakespeare's Hamlet through Google Translate. The words might come out. What made Hamlet likely won't. That's not a dismissal of the technology, and Wasserman is careful to say so himself. He agrees the tools work well on formulaic material, the decrees and receipts built from repeating patterns. His argument is narrower and harder to dismiss. The material that matters most, the writing that reveals how ancient people actually thought and felt, is exactly the material these systems still handle worst. That gap between what's solved and what isn't is worth sitting with, because it shapes where all of this is actually headed next. Where this is headed, every tool covered so far solves one piece of a much larger goal, and researchers across these projects describe the same endpoint: point a phone camera at a tablet in a museum case and get an instant, readable translation back. That goal is still some distance off, and the reason isn't the AI itself. It's a much simpler bottleneck sitting in front of all of it. Of the roughly 500,000 cuneiform tablets known to exist, only around 100,000 have even been photographed and entered into a database an AI could actually work from. The rest are still sitting untouched, waiting for someone to take the picture in the first place. So the honest version of this story isn't that AI has already read everything. It's that AI has finally started clearing 150 years of backlog, character by character, fragment by fragment, gap by gap, fast enough that the small number of human experts left in this field might actually catch up to the material in their own lifetimes. Scientists used AI to translate ancient Sumerian tablets, and what changed wasn't one discovery. It was finally being able to read a century and a half of backlog, lost epics, ordinary lives. The oldest writing on Earth is only now starting to be heard.